process, and it's a train wreck. You can't get good results, good information, if it isn't really, really laid out properly. That's again what we have frameworks for. So, having said that, we move forward. That means it helps provide decision makers, responsible parties, with a better understanding of their risk, so that way it can help them better achieve consistent achievement of objectives. We kind of saw that in some practice questions and also some content earlier. So let's go ahead and get to ISACA's idea. If you want to quickly implement a technical solution that deviates from company policies, well, you can't just jump to it until you perform a risk assessment to see if it's going to increase the organization's risk, and if it does it increase it beyond risk appetite, the threshold for risk? In other words, you may not be able to implement a new technical solution until you see how well it really supports the organization's tolerance for various kinds of risk. Makes sense. Look before you leap, essentially. So, if a new system is introduced to the environment, an internal ad hoc risk assessment should be performed prior to normally scheduled annual occurrence. I think that's a lot of fancy words for, hey, if you're about to introduce a new system, you should probably go ahead and do a risk assessment to see how that's going to affect the rest of the systems, even though it isn't scheduled yet because it's not February. Get a new system in March, don't wait till next February to do a risk assessment. Do it before you implement. I think that's obvious. Very technical, wordy way of saying the same thing. Again, risk assessment, risk identification. Again, they talk about a cause and effect diagram, also known as a fishbone diagram. If this happens, this, or if this happens, this will cause this result. Again, if I have enough of those, it looks like a fishbone diagram. It looks like a fish with bones. You can look it up on the internet if you wish. It'll be more than you need for the exam, but I provided a link just in case you have thirsty knowledge thirsty. What you will need to know for your exam, though, is a cause and effect analysis is most appropriate for determining root cause or a source of a risk. Good to know for your exam. By the way, the reason I mentioned the fishbone diagram is because it is a cause and effect diagram, right? So, risk assessment, risk identification. Hey, it is the first phase of doing a risk assessment, right? So, before I can analyze a risk, I need to understand what risk I'm looking at. And I'll go ahead and take a look at, again, a newly discovered risk is then reported to senior management once you complete the risk assessment. And in the risk identification, it says, for example, if a business unit discovers that an application poses some risk to data privacy, perhaps within certain regions where the organization operates, that newly identified risk, what should you do with it? Now they're going to say, oh, you go ahead and implement a control to address it. Oh, you go ahead and wait, you don't fix anything until you report this identified risk to the person who has the authority to determine if we're going to do something with it. That they call the Chief Privacy Officer. It's ISACA's exam, don't blame me. Risk identification, again, I already talked about risk identification being an entire phase. Actually, within that phase, there are other projects. We need to identify the assets at risk, the threats that apply to those assets, the vulnerabilities that apply to those assets, the controls that we already have, and potential consequences. None of that's on your test, but that's really what goes into a full-on risk identification. Now, ISACA skips all that part, and they just point out that you have to identify a risk based on the recognition of a combination of threats, vulnerabilities, assets, and controls. That's the way they say it, but it does back up into good understood standard as well. And I appreciate that. It wasn't always so. Again, we have to identify our assets that are at risk in order to understand the risk that we have. Assets. Remember, an asset can be anything that has value to the organization. Even knowledge in someone's head is an asset. The state of achieving compliance is an asset that you want to protect. Now, in order to protect it, however, who has the ultimate authority for how it's protected? The asset owner. So it turns out, this is tricky, before conducting a risk assessment, You can't even know what to measure the risk against or how to conduct it if you haven't identified risk owners first. They're the only ones that have the authority for how that risk will be treated and mitigated. So they'll ask, given this terrible scenario, what's the very first thing you're going to do? And what's the very first step of your risk assessment? And you'll say, oh, to identify assets. I remember, Alan told me. But remember, within asset identification, you also need to identify your risk owners, the asset owners. So they are often the most suitable person to determine the asset's value to the organization. Practice question. It's all fun and games, right? No, not really, but it'll help you pass your test. What is the most appropriate for determining the source or root cause of any given risk? According to ISACA, what would you say? Okay, so what did we answer? Cause and effect analysis. Thank you very much. Exactly. Now, a risk assessment, yeah, overall that would, but again, the most appropriate answer, according to ISACA, the tool that we would use, the technique that we would use in particular for discovering the source or root cause of a risk is a cause and effect analysis. Turns out within a risk assessment, whether it be risk identification, risk analysis, risk evaluation, there are different techniques that you can use within each. ISO 31010 has a whole catalog of risk assessment techniques. Some of them are appropriate for risk identification and root cause analysis. Some of them more appropriate for better estimation of probability and likelihood. Well, aren't those risk assessments too? No, they are techniques used in a risk assessment for a particular piece of that risk assessment, essentially. Yeah. So we move on. By the way, I have a question from SB. Can I use your training to claim my CPE? Well, this particular training would be nice. The problem is that firstly, they don't really have any way of, they being O'Reilly, doesn't have any way of really verifying it's you that's sitting this training, and that's firstly. And secondly, they don't issue certificates. And when it comes to claiming CPE or continuing professional education credit, the actual certifier, such as ISACA, the certification body, they have requirements for what they need to prove out your CPE credit that you've earned. And one of them is they're going to want to see an attendance certificate that is issued to your name and signed by a qualified instructor for a given amount of hours. I'm teaching through O'Reilly in this event, and they don't issue certificates for CPE credit currently, or in the past. If it happens, it'll be a new capability. So no, this particular training you won't be able to use for CPE credit unless you just self-attest, I suppose. But even then, it would be a little suspect in terms of trying to prove it out if you needed to. You can take a look at the training that we have on CIS's website, which is not free, but it does issue CPE certificates for completion, and they are to your name, and they actually have my signature on them. So just so you know. Moving on, good question though. Threat modeling, threat landscape goes by quickly. Threats are what they sound like. You have vulnerabilities that allow something bad to happen, but then you have threats that actually are the threat actor that causes something to happen. The fact that my currency is paper, it's vulnerable to fire. Fire is the threat. The fact that it's paper means that it's vulnerable. Oh, well, what about your coins? You can throw those in the fire if you want. Doesn't matter. They're not vulnerable to fire. So in order for a risk event to occur, we got to have a vulnerability to the threat the threat needs to act on the vulnerability. Before you get all freaked out, if you don't have an asset at risk, then it doesn't really matter anyway. So, for example, your money just burned. It was paper, and you exposed it to fire, and it burned. I know, but it was fake money. It was monopoly money. It wasn't worth anything. The consequence actually happened, but didn't have any impact. Oh, wow. I guess I should have known about all that stuff before I really analyzed the value of it. That was back in the risk identification. You have to identify your assets, your vulnerabilities, your threats, but then also you have to identify the potential consequence, which is not necessarily the same as the impact. Consequence is the money burned. The impact, not much, because it was fake money. Sticky. Not on your exam, on this exam, on a risk management exam for 31,000. Different thing. So going back to threats. A threat is anything that has potential to harm assets, such as information, processes, systems, therefore harms the organization itself. So the hacker that causes problems would be characterized as a threat. The fact that we leave the door open, whether figuratively with our network or physically with literally our server door open, I've seen that, that's a vulnerability. Had an organization once that I visited that they, of course, they didn't allow smoking in the building. So they would leave the back door unlocked so they could easily go out and get back in to go smoke cigarettes, which left a security vulnerability that somebody could easily walk in and take their equipment. Of course, they might have to overwhelm some of the people there, but you see what I'm saying. Open door, vulnerability. The person who comes in through the open door and takes your stuff, threat. So going on to threats. Again, a threat can arise from within or outside the organization. So an example in your exam, the project manager, most appropriate for identifying project-related risk that could threaten the successful completion of a software development project. Well, a risk itself is not the threat. I would want to know what was it that threatened the successful completion. Could be conflicting demands for time. You know why I couldn't be there to get the job done? Because somebody else hijacked me for a different project. Oh, well, how did you let them do that? I was vulnerable to it. He was my boss. Oh, see where I'm going? Threats versus vulnerabilities. So, if you are worried about social engineering, malware attacks, and things like this that may perhaps have taken advantage of unsuspecting employees, you need to make those employees aware of such threats and to be careful. So your control to the threats are not to stop the threats themselves, but we also want to make ourselves less vulnerable to them. So again, employee awareness training reduces the vulnerability to the threat of social engineering and other types of attacks. Threat modeling, threat landscape, periodically reassessing risk and threats is necessary because business risk changes over time. Threats increase, they decrease. Vulnerabilities increase, they decrease. The value of the asset at risk changes as well. So we're always having to reassess things. So the first step in any risk assessment, they say, is to gather information about the current state and pending internal and external changes to the enterprise's environment. Getting information about your assets at risk is always a good first step. That's an awful cumbersome way of saying it, but that's their exam, not mine. What should you do? How often should you do a complete threat analysis? They say on a yearly basis. Really? In real life, it depends. If it's really, really critical, it'll often be more than once a year you'll reassess. It's up to you, right? But ISACA on exam day says no less than a yearly basis. So we go ahead and again, what are the primary reasons why business risk should be periodically reassessed? Hey, if you can remember back from last slide, you can get the answer right, which means we're in a race. You have just a little bit of time to select your answer in 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. 100% business risk subject to frequent change. You nailed it. Good job. So, vulnerability, control deficiency analysis. Wowee. Again, sounds fancy. Not. It's a weakness. We're looking for where you left it unprotected, which didn't cause it to go bad, but made it where it could go bad. Again, if your computer is vulnerable to moisture and water, it's vulnerable to it. Leaving it outside overnight didn't cause it to go bad, unless the threat comes along, like rain or the morning dew, then attacks that vulnerability and your computer's ruined. So again, vulnerabilities don't cause loss, but they allow it to happen. All right, so as we move on, again, it's essentially a weakness in the design, implementation, operation of, or control of a process that could expose the enterprise to threats that would take advantage of them. Maybe you'll be lucky and the threats won't do it. It won't rain, but then maybe not. Again, they also talk about even a control itself is subject to risk and vulnerability. For example, you might have insurance as a control, but what if you forgot to pay the insurance premiums? It's vulnerable to not working as expected. You bought a generator in order to have ongoing standby power, but you're vulnerable to the fact that it needs fuel and you forgot to buy gasoline or petrol. You get my point. Even controls can be vulnerable. What do we use to detect vulnerabilities to external attacks? ISACA says that's penetration tests, or a type of vulnerability assessment. Again, different types of vulnerabilities can result from organizational vulnerabilities. Roles, responsibilities are not segregated as they should be. That leaves us vulnerable to potential fraud and abuse. Processes and procedures often are vulnerable because they were built assuming that everything would work just fine and don't actually accommodate the fact that maybe things won't work as they're planned. So they're vulnerable. Management chains, personnel, physical environment, examples of assets that can have vulnerabilities. Again, establishing, maintaining baseline configurations of hardware, software, releases of internally developed systems is a very important component of configuration management. Why are we saying it here? Because having good baselines helps ensure that you'll be able to consistently manage setting up systems in a way that's already thought to be not so vulnerable. So ISACA feels misconfiguration of hardware leads to potential vulnerabilities, which is why they like those baselines so much. Again, like I say, vulnerabilities don't cause loss. But ISACA will say a lack of adequate controls is characterized as a vulnerability. No, not having controls to counteract the vulnerability leaves you with the vulnerabilities that were already there. It didn't create them. But in ISACA's world, they say not having controls is a vulnerability. No controls, you get the point. It's ISACA's test. Don't blame me. They also say, perhaps, that an insufficient controls actually cause an increase in vulnerabilities. Wow, I wasn't vulnerable, but now you went and gave me controls and took them away, and that created new vulnerabilities. No, they counter vulnerabilities, and if you don't have the controls, then the vulnerabilities are there. But they didn't cause them to exist. So even though that doesn't make a whole lot of sense, it's not you that's crazy, it's everybody else. Project vulnerabilities and risks. They're going to ask you a few questions about potential vulnerabilities to a project not working properly. ISACA does tend to use threats in their example, and you got to figure out what allowed you to be vulnerable to those threats. And by the way, again, who was it? SB, you took your CISM exam. I told you then in preparing, I said, when you learn about SQL injection attacks, you're going to be learning about it for this test and all the other ones. And it's true. The very same ones that same questions that you encountered in your CISM, you're going to encounter the same or similar on your CRISC exam. SQL injection vulnerability. Basically, you've got a public web form that actually goes to a database. When you put data in that form on the web page, that data is sent to a database and processed as fields. What if you put database commands in the actual name field or the email field? you could actually perhaps get that command interpreted and used in the database when it should have been looking at it as just a simple piece of data. So that means you need to make sure that your web form has extra capability to only allow some permissible fields. It doesn't allow SQL commands. It doesn't allow you to try to remotely insert a file by referring to it with a hyperlink and things like this. So again, how are you still vulnerable to such an attack? By not sufficiently validating your data input fields. Here in the O'Reilly marathon 3 to 4 times. It is a marathon, isn't it? You think it's tough for you? I got to do all this talking. You just got to listen to it. Vulnerability and control, deficiency analysis. It's just repeats of the same basic stuff. It's not very complicated, but you need to memorize it for your tests. SP says in a marathon kind of way. More examine scenarios talking about vulnerabilities that you need to memorize for your exam prep. SP, you did that, right? Practice questions. Which of the following choices reveals exploitable vulnerabilities in the enterprise's network? If you did antivirus scanning, if you did anti-malware scanning, if you did external penetration tests, or perhaps intrusion detection systems. Don't go with logic. Feel the force, Luke. Just go with what I taught you, and you will have it right on exam day. What do you think? What is it? And the answer is very nice. External penetration tests. Antivirus scanning is really more threat analysis, is it not? It's not really looking for how you're vulnerable to viruses. By the way, good job on everybody for not choosing intrusion detection systems. Same thing. It's looking for potential attacks. It's not really looking to alert on vulnerabilities sitting around that are vulnerable to the attack. Pardon me. One moment, maybe that'll clear it up, hopefully. On the tail end of 4 hours of speaking, I have to keep my radio voice. Risk scenario development. Now we're getting into a full-on risk scenario, which includes an asset at risk, a risk event, others call it a consequence, and a risk impact, meaning that you actually have to have, well, meaningful consequence. Like I said, paper money burning. I don't know. Was it counterfeit or real? It was real. Oh, dang, that's impactful. Monopoly money, not so much. So again, that's what ISACA says a risk scenario includes. Folks, if I hadn't prepared for the exam, that would have got me. I think I know something about risk management. It's what I do kind of for a living. And I would have said, well, any risk scenario, show me what's at risk, show me the vulnerability for the consequence, show me the threat that acted on the vulnerability to result in the consequence. And I would call that more of a risk scenario, but that's not right on exam day. On an exam day, it's an asset, the risk consequence, and then the impact of that consequence. Because risk is measured in impact, not in consequence. I fell down. Did you get hurt? No. So no big deal, right? Consequence, falling down. That happened. Impact, not so much. That kind of thing. It's like last night when I was watching the Super Bowl, and I watched an ankle injury that didn't look like it was going to be an ankle injury, but took the quarterback out of the game. So I was surprised. Didn't seem to be much consequence, but had a whole lot of impact. I was originally born in Kansas, so I was happy to see not enough to matter. We won the game anyway. Notice how when it's your team that wins, it's a we thing. When your team doesn't win, you talk about how they lost. Strange that. Putting it all together with risk scenarios. Again, risk scenarios are created from consideration of the threats that an enterprise faces. You and I both know means risk scenarios is more than that, but on exam day, that'll get you by. A list of potential threats to assets cataloged in a risk register is how we develop risk scenarios. Notice how ISACA is focusing so much on threats and not really talking about vulnerabilities. That just tends to be their bias. Moving along, risk scenario development. It's, again, more repetitive stuff, very, very similar to what I've already taught you. Risk assessments, top down versus bottom up. What they really mean is proactive versus reactive. Proactive is where you're saying, hey, before a risk event ever happens, the consequence ever is realized, let's do some what if consideration and determine, if this happened, what would it do to us? Top down risk assessment. Bottom up, dang, that happened, and now we're in big trouble. Let's see how much that cost us. That's after the fact. ISACA talks about being bottom-up approach, meaning you assess risk after having had the consequence. The consequence drove you to do a risk assessment. We know that that's not the effective, efficient way to handle things. That just signifies that you weren't managing risk. If you're dealing with consequence, I tell people, if you don't manage risk ahead of the consequence, you're not called a risk manager. You're called a crisis manager, because that's all you're doing. You're not managing risk, you're managing crisis. So when developing IT risk scenarios with a top-down approach, you want to identify business objectives of the organizations and then proactively do what-if analysis on that, right? They like bottom-up approach, reactive risk assessment, because they said it's very true to life. Okay, normally we would try to avoid crisis management if it's possible. So, risk scenario development, your own organizational structure, policy, standards, technology, all of this are criteria used when analyzing risk scenarios. That's true. Identifying those risk factors is the very first step when developing IT risk scenarios they ask you about. Again, other just exam points to memorize for your exam. If you're any information about newly discovered risk should be communicated to decision makers before you actually try to do something about it. Because why? You may not be in a position of authority to decide what to do about that risk. So you report it on to those that do. Again, a threat-based approach to risk assessment identifies potential methods of attack, the corresponding vulnerabilities to be exploited, but also the credibility of the threat itself, and also potential damage, potential impact. So let's go ahead. What kind of approach to risk assessment identifies potential methods of attack, vulnerabilities that can be exploited, intent of the attacker, and potential damage? It's an impact-based approach, an asset-based approach, scenario-based approach, threat-based approach. What would you say? All right, let's see what we ended up with. The actual answer is threat-based approach, I believe. Yeah. Go ahead and check my work. Yeah. So, moving on, we now go on to risk analysis and evaluation. Look at risk analysis methodologies. We also look at risk assessment concepts, standards, and frameworks. We look at evaluating something called inherent risk, which is before you add any controls, versus what's left over after the controls, residual risk. Oh, dang, I already taught that module now. Business impact analysis, we'll talk more about that as well. as well as that risk register that they already referred to earlier. So risk analysis methodologies. Again, they talk about how to try to estimate risk. Well, it turns out risk estimation can be qualitative, meaning relative. I can't tell you how much that compliance risk is going to be worth, but I can tell you it's going to be bad. Bad compared to what? Real bad. My point is that we can subjectively scale risk when quantification really isn't available. So, well, how would you qualify real bad? Well, real bad is the kind that could shut us down. Bad is the kind that's just going to cost us a lot of money, but we'll still be able to keep going. Oh, okay, so one is more significant than the other. Again, it's more of a comparative risk estimation. We'll talk about qualitative versus objective, where you can get into actual numbers because of history and historic values that you've learned. So selecting a risk assessment technique, your estimation methodology. Projects affecting multiple business functions, processes typically have more risk inherent before controls than if they were isolated, because ISACA feels that they could cross-contaminate each other. Again, that's ISACA's feeling. A system relied upon by a higher number of business processes tends to be more critical than even if the individual importance of any one of those elements is still relatively low. Meaning if one of the business processes failed, it would be no big deal. But if a system supports many business processes and all of them would fail because of that system, then that system failure means a lot more by adding all of the other downstream consequences together. So again, going back to qualitative versus quantitative risk assessment. SB, same stuff from your CISM exam. Seriousness of the threats, relative sensitivity of the assets are given a ranking in qualitative approach. Basically, a ranking of I don't know how much it is in numbers, but I know it's a 1 is more than a 2, or 2 is more than a 1, 3 is more than a 2, and so forth. Qualitative assessment measures the risk without using numbers, using more adjective scales, grades, etc. Although you'll still see numbers used, but they're still grades. If the impact of a risk cannot be effectively projected in quantifiable terms, then you'll need a qualitative risk assessment. So again, this is where you'll see risk ranked as high, medium, and low. Not important, important, very important, or perhaps on a scale of 1 to 10, even though you don't know what a 5 really means in terms of impact. Qualitative analysis will be most reliant on analysis of risk scenarios for the purpose of risk ranking. So we use qualitative risk analysis for risk ranking. We use quantitative risk analysis for risk quantification. All right, one method for qualitative risk analysis would be something known as the Delphi technique. Again, you don't need to know it in depth or how to practice it, but you do know that it is a technique for qualitative risk analysis. Essentially, how does it work? You're not going to really be tested on how it works, but in case you want to know, the idea is that we're going to get 5 experts in a room or more, and we're going to ask them, hey, we can't really know in numbers what this is going to be worth, but if we had to say which risk is worse, this one or that one, what's your opinion? If 4 out of 5 experts say that one, then we'll know that it's more significant than the other. It's still opinion-based. You're hoping to get a good opinion and consensus by using good experts, but what if you didn't use good experts? That means the technique is vulnerable to not being accurate. So, again, you won't need to know all of that, just basically that it's good for qualitative risk analysis. Again, it's the best risk identification technique for an enterprise that allows employees to identify risk anonymously because it is practiced with anonymous input. Quantitative, this is where you're trying to get real numbers. That's why it says quantity, quantitative. For that, you need to have some history. It uses measurable, objective data to determine asset value, historic probability of loss, and potential associated impacts and risks. It uses real numbers to measure risk in terms of monetary values, is what you need to know. Again, it has a better idea of using true percentages of likelihood and impact to calculate an overall level of risk. For example, know the difference between quantitative and qualitative risk analysis. Here's some more example examples. Again, more